Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Alvaro Huerta, and today we have a brilliant speaker. She's a Ford Fellow, so you know she's brilliant because I'm a Ford Fellow too. So only 3% of people who apply get the Ford Fellowship, and unfortunately, this will be the last opportunity for people to apply because the foundation is terminating the program. So for me, I'm very interested in listening to diverse voices, both domestic and international. And here we have a brilliant speaker who's going to speak to us about her research. She's are you a candidate or a PhD candidate at UCI, at University of California at Irvine. So I'll just have her introduce herself and then pretty much take it away. I just gonna be more like a facilitator and play behind the scenes type of role. So take it away.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and hi everybody. It's nice to meet all of you. My name is Kharad Siddiqui. Khairad is the correct pronunciation if you can pronounce it, but I just go by Kharad. And like was said earlier, I'm a Ford Fellow and a PhD student, not yet a candidate, but hopefully by December, a candidate at UC Irvine. So I'm not far away from y'all. Yeah, and I'll be giving a speech today on a paper that I have that's forthcoming. It's kind of under review at a journal right now, and it's on honor crime and abolitionist feminism and a couple of other things that I'm really excited to talk to y'all about. So thank you so much for letting me talk to you. I'm just going to go ahead and get into it. I'm going to share my screen and get started. Okay. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, I see nods. All right. So like I said, this is going to be a presentation on a paper that I actually co-wrote, but it's a broader project that I've been working on for a little bit, which is an examination of Qandeel Baloch and using the honor crime as a site of transnational abolitionist imagination. Big words, but we'll get into it in the presentation. I'm really excited to talk about it a little bit more. So Qandeel Baloch was a 26-year-old Pakistani woman who in 2016 was killed in her home in Multan in Pakistan by what would later be revealed to be her brother. And so this whole project focuses on Qandeel Baloch's case for a couple of different reasons. So after Qandeel Baloch was killed by her brother in Pakistan, the reported reason that he gave, although the actual case was much more complicated and there was a lot of detail and many events that kind of led up to what happened and what ultimately culminated in her death. But after everything that happened, she was basically used as the figurehead of this broader campaign and this ideological campaign surrounding the honor crime within Pakistan. So she was constructed as the victim of an honor crime and then used as a figurehead of this really large movement to crack down very harshly and punitively on prosecuting honor crime within Pakistan. And many details of her life would become obfuscated as a result of this. She'd be constructed in this very narrow articulation of Muslim women's victimhood within the global South. And this kind of much broader campaign would take place. So what I'm interested in this paper and in this project in doing is retelling Qandeel's life while actually paying close attention to the story of her as a person, the very complicated figure that she was, and including room for nuance that was obfuscated, unfortunately, in the predominant narratives that took over after her death, but also using her case specifically as a way of examining three things that I look at within this project. So the first thing that I'm interested in examining is actually destabilizing the very construction of the honor crime itself. So knowing that she was constructed as a victim of this framework of honor crime, I think it's interesting to look at Qandeel's life and also just to think more deeply about what it means to construct the honor crime as the honor crime and to deploy that framework in the geographic locations that it's most often deployed, and how often that ideological construction of the honor crime can be used in service of broader projects like imperialism or military expansion. The second part that I'm really interested in focusing on using Qandeel's life is carceral feminism within the global north. And so I'll talk more about what carceral feminism is in a little bit later on into the project. But looking at carceral feminism and specifically how international feminist organizations based within the global north, so many of them based within the US, would intervene in Pakistan after Qandeel's death, and how they would export the framework of carceral feminism into Pakistani society, and specifically as a response to what happened to Qandeel. And then finally, the third thing that I'm interested in using Qandeel's case as a way of examining is abolitionist feminism in conversation with third world approaches to international law, and specifically thinking about what Pakistan and the pre-existing law within Pakistan and a re-examination of Qandeel's life might actually teach us as people who think about abolition and feminism. I'm referring to myself, but also the community of intellectuals that I feel most tied to. What it might teach us as people who are thinking about abolition and feminism within the global north by looking to Pakistan as an example. So those are the kind of three things that I'll be talking about within this presentation. To get into the first one, which is destabilizing the very construction of the honor crime itself, there are two main sources that I pull from in order to do this. The first is Laila Abulugod's Do Muslim Women Need Saving? The entire book is fantastic, and I highly recommend that people check it out. And the second is Dana Olwan's exploration of Aqsa Pervez and her life and death. So Do Muslim Women Need Saving? This is a work wherein Laila Abulugod examines all kinds of other questions about Muslim women and their agency and their construction specifically as victims of exceptional gendered violence. But there is a section where she thinks about honor crime specifically, and she really destabilizes our assumptions and presuppositions that might guide our analysis of the honor crime as this like naturally occurring category within the world. And so as all of us hopefully know, crime is not something that just occurs naturally within the world. It's something that the state designates, and then that thing gets constructed as a crime, right? And so it's really interesting to think about this in the context of the honor crime specifically, because this is a framework that's only ever deployed in the context of the global south, the third world, and most common and most often within the context of Muslim majority societies towards Muslim women. And so thinking about that and why the honor crime as a framework is deployed within the colonial imagination as something that exists within the societies is something that Abulugod does. And she talks about how it really reifies this idea of the Muslim world and of the global south as spaces of exceptional violence and endemic oppression towards women. And so the idea is that obviously patriarchy is global, but somehow thinking about the honor crime or analyzing the honor crime as a framework has always done the ideological work of constructing the Muslim world and the global south as spaces that are somehow exceptionally patriarchal or exceptionally violent towards women, when we know that the honor crime is not really a category that's used by people within these spaces, right? Like it's not something that's talked about by people within the spaces where it's talked about as like an endemic thing within the global north. And what we might refer to as an honor crime would really be considered just familial violence or gender-based violence within those contexts. And that's another thing that she really does is talk about how the construction of this category is reified and legitimized through media interpretations, depictions of it, even reports. So for example, Pakistan is considered the honor crime capital of the world, but Abulugod does a really good job at troubling how those statistics are kind of come to, and how all kinds of different forms of gender-based violence are all collapsed when they happen within the global south or to Muslim women as under the broad banner of honor crime, when had they occurred to anybody else at any other time, they might be called something else. They might be called domestic violence, or it might be called all kinds of other names, but is instead referred to as an honor crime because it's happening in the specific place to the specific person. So again, she focuses really deeply on how this category is reified and how it's legitimized, and specifically the ideological work that that's doing, which I think is really important in foregrounding the analysis of Qandeel's life. And so that's what I get from Abu Lughod. Then to move to Dana Olwan has a piece on Aqsa Pervez. And so Aqsa Pervez was a 16-year-old Pakistani girl who was killed by her father in Canada. And Dana Olwan does a really beautiful analysis of how the narratives that sprung up after Aqsa Pervez's death were used in service of all of these ideological projects. There was quite a bit of anti-Muslim and white supremacist logic that popped up after Aqsa Pervez's death that talked about the need for Muslim immigrants to assimilate into Canada's values, and just quite a bit of like nationalist sentiment that popped up. But she also really closely follows these ideological currents that swept up Aqsa Pervez and her legacy. And she talks about how there's a monument erected in Aqsa Pervez's honor in Israel years after her death, in Aqsa Pervez's honor and in honor of all victims of honor crime everywhere. So she really focuses on how, you know, these ideological currents can move such that victims of honor crime are used in service of these larger ideological projects that they can't really consent to being used for, right? Like in the project of imperialism or military expansion, or in the case of Israel in this settler colonial state. So Dana Olwan explores that, which is something that I try to do within this paper in Qandeel Baloch's case. And she also posits this notion of what she calls posthumous subjects of solidarity. So she talks about the bodies of murdered Muslim women being posthumous subjects of solidarity, again, being used in service of ideological campaigns that they can't consent to because they're no longer alive to kind of determine where their legacy is going to go. But they're often used in kind of all of these ways in service of these projects. So all of that is very, very important foregrounding in just thinking about how we talk about honor crime and destabilizing the very idea of it as this naturally occurring thing, and knowing that every time the framework of honor crime is being used, there's ideological work being done on some level, and thinking really deeply about what that ideological work is, or what the larger project might be that is in effect when we're using a framework like honor crime. So having all of that background, I feel comfortable now returning to Qandeel's case. I think it's really important to foreground all of that before we talk about Qandeel, so that we're really able to think critically about the narratives that she was used in service of. And so when I think about Qandeel's case, within the paper, like I said, I give much more attention and detail and nuance to the actual details of her life. She was a very complicated figure, a very intelligent woman. She reinvented herself a number of times. But just for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into all of it in the presentation right now. But I also focus really deeply on the actions that were taken after Qandeel's death. And something that I'm really interested in specifically is the international feminist response to Qandeel's death. So I look at a bunch of organizations. The one that I look at most closely is Equality Now, which is an organization that's based in New York and has kind of a long history of intervening within the global South in the name of women's liberation within these spaces through kind of controversial means and tactics. So they kind of they wrote previously really controversial statements regarding the burqa during the initial invasion of Afghanistan. But I focus really specifically, obviously, on their actions after Qandeel's case. So thinking about how most murdered Muslim women become posthumous subjects of solidarity, there is a broader ideological campaign to more harshly punish honor crime, what was seen as an epidemic of honor crime within Pakistan that existed before Qandeel. But after Qandeel's death, she would be used as the figurehead of this campaign. Her legacy, I should say, would be used as the figurehead of this campaign. And there would be massive amounts of international attention that were paid specifically to Qandeel's life and to her death. And Equality Now is one of these really large mainstream Western feminist organizations that was acting to really put pressure on the Pakistani government to more harshly sentence honor crime. So what one of the main things that they were trying to do is repeal what they saw as a loophole in Pakistani law. So this is where it becomes really important to know that, again, the honor crime is not really a conception that most places within the global South understand or know about or interact with. And so Pakistani law had nothing regarding honor crime before Qandeel's unfortunate death. What they did have, though, was a law that was a holdover from Sharia that referred specifically to cases of murder, wherein it's called the Qisas and Diyat law, and it basically is just a framework wherein if somebody was murdered, then the family member of the person who had passed away could choose to pardon the person who was accused of the murder. And if they chose to do that, they would accept financial restitution from that person instead of going through the judicial system and giving them a much harsher sentence. And so this was something that was viewed as a form of mercy and compassion, something that really allowed for the family to kind of make the active decision and how they wanted to go about grieving, the person that they had lost, accepting financial restitution, which wouldn't have happened otherwise if they had gone through the state, but also it's a form of mercy to the person who might have committed the crime as well. And so that was what the existing Pakistani law was. These mainstream feminist organizations viewed this as a legal loophole for honor crime, specifically because they argued that, one, there's often tremendous pressure upon women specifically to forgive people within patriarchal societies, and two, because honor crimes are constructed as something that occurs within the family, they argued that family members were very likely to be sympathetic to the person who might have tried to commit the act of violence against the woman and not towards like the woman herself. So essentially that they would just pardon or forgive anybody who might have like tried to commit an honor crime, and thus that this was like a legal loophole. That person would never have to go through the judicial system or the legal system, and they would never face punishment. So they were putting pressure, these international feminist organizations were putting pressure on the Pakistani government to repeal this quote unquote loophole. And they did this through a variety of means, but one of the main ways that they did it that garnered massive amounts of online attention was through internet petitions. And so what I have here in front of you right now is a quote from one of these legal petitions that they circulated that garnered thousands upon thousands and thousands of signatures. They had celebrity endorsements on these. It had massive amounts of media attention. And they were legal petitions to get these kind of loopholes revealed and to intervene specifically in Qandeel's case. So they were actually successful in a number of these things. They actually managed to pass legislation in Punjab in Pakistan that mandated a 25-year sentence for anyone accused of attempting to commit or committing an honor crime. And so they were successful at going about this. And so what I have here is a quote from one of those petitions that's actually an update. And so after they successfully intervened in Qandeel's case, which they also were really pushing in Qandeel's case for the government to step in and take over, because her family had expressed really complicated feelings of grief during this process, which makes sense, right? Interfamilial grief is a very complicated process, and they had gone through this intense rupture within their family where they had lost their daughter. The first picture that I had shown was actually Qandeel's mother holding up two images of her. And so they had grieved very publicly at the loss of their daughter and were incredibly distraught. But they had also indicated at some point, although they were ambivalent about this, they had indicated sometimes that they maybe didn't want their son to go to prison and would kind of prefer to, solve the situation within their family in whatever way they saw fit. But instead of kind of allowing the family that space or the latitude to make that decision themselves, Equality Now was very, very intent on stepping in within the situation and making the state the complainant in Qandeel's case. So this is an update actually from one of the petitions after a legal change had taken place in Qandeel's case. So what they say is, we are heartened to learn that Qandeel's killer will be prosecuted. On Monday, the police announced that the state will be the main complainant in the case, meaning that the family cannot pardon the brother who killed her. this is a significant step, and we praise the government for its intervention in this case. However, the law still needs to be changed so that no one who kills a woman in the name of honor can go free. So there's so much to pull out from this quote. And I could talk about it for a very long time, but I think just the main things that I want to draw your attention to is that one, they're allying really closely with the state. Okay, that becomes really important later on within the project for the kind of frameworks that we're talking about, but they're seeing the state as their ally in this case and not the family. And the second thing to kind of call attention to is this very harsh on crime rhetoric that they're talking about towards the end, where they talk about the law needing to be changed so that no one who kills a woman in the name of honor can go free, reifying the construction of the honor crime as a natural category, but also talking about changing the law so that there's a mandatory sentence for all of this. So those are kind of the main things that I want to pull our attention to. And I argue that in this petition, what you can see the most clearly is this nexus of carceral feminism and imperial feminism, but really like how deeply rooted equality now is, and their language is in the logic of carceral feminism. And so what is carceral feminism? For those who don't know, carceral feminism is a framework that's talked about within the literature. And it's basically a neoliberal alliance between the state and feminist movements. So at the core of carceral feminism is a belief that the state actually protects women. And so all state apparatuses also protect women. So police protect women, prisons, military, whatever. All of these state apparatuses actually protect women, and they ally very closely with these state apparatuses. And so it's often been very deeply rooted in the construction of a certain category of women's victimhood. So within the US context, this would usually be the construction of white women victimhood as a means of promoting carceral expansion. And the kind of most common thing that people point to when they talk about carceral feminism, the most common piece of legislation that scholars writing about it talk about is the Violence Against Women Act of the 90s. So this was something that was passed again under the Clinton administration, right? So under a really tough on crime era, where there's all of this growth in mass incarceration. And the Violence Against Women Act was an act that was really pushed for by mainstream feminist organizations. They lobbied very hard for it. And it allocated millions and millions and millions of dollars to police and prisons. And it was a huge driver of mass incarceration, which, as we know, has really ravaged Black and Brown communities, the carceral state itself being kind of an apparatus that's built on anti-Black racism. And so, you know, has perpetuated all of this suffering for so long. Carceral feminism essentially is just the root of what would pass a piece of legislation like this deep-seated belief that women need to be protected, the state will do the protecting, police and prisons will do the protecting, and then allying themselves with the carceral state and causing, you know, inadvertently or advertently or what have you, essentially allowing for all of this increase in police power and prison power that has kind of landed us in the situation that we've landed within today. And so that's what carceral feminism is. I argue that within the petition that I just talked about, you really see the language of carceral feminism in them saying that no one who attempts to commit any act of gendered violence against a woman can go free. This is like it mirrors kind of the language of like mandatory minimums. And I argue that this is the nexus of carceral feminism and imperial feminism, which is imperial feminism is, you know, the category of a certain kind of woman within the global South, usually as also needing protection or as exclusively victimized, and then the means of that protection usually being military intervention into those spaces. And so in this case, I argue that you kind of see the nexus of those two things in the way that Equality Now is talking about honor crime in Pakistan. So what that brings up for me is this really big question that I'm really interested in using as a through thread throughout this entire piece, which is how often does the ideological construction of a certain category of women as victims in need of protection allow for carceral, imperial, or military expansion in the name of their liberation? Again, so thinking about how women get constructed as victims and then get used in service of ideological projects. So carceral feminism within the global north, or Muslim women as victims being used as in service of an ideological project of military expansion within those places, or carceral expansion, or what have you. This is just a through thread that I'm really thinking about throughout this piece, is how feminism can be used in allyship with the state. So finally, the last thing that I'm going to that I focus on within this project and that I'll end with is thinking about abolitionist lessons from the third world. So we talked about carceral feminism, and I gave a really, really brief overview of what it is. That's like quite surface level. But the opposite of carceral feminism would be something like abolitionist feminism, right? Like abolitionists who are thinking about abolishing the prison industrial complex, abolishing police, and policing power, and seeing these institutions as ones that thrive or whose foundations are built off of anti-Black racism, white supremacy, indigenous genocide, settler colonialism, all of these things. They really abolitionist feminists really attempt to return feminism to its original radical platform, and extricate it from its very, very deep ties to carceral thinking, which unfortunately the two are really bound up together now within the global north. And so abolitionist feminists are doing the very difficult work of disentangling one from the other. And what I'm interested in doing in this project is actually putting all of that work in conversation with TWAIL, which TWAIL is third world approaches to international law. And it's this international dimension that really focuses on flipping work on the global south and on the third world on its head. So most work on international law looks at the global south and the third world as spaces that need to be civilized or are devoid of human rights or what have you, like some form of liberation, and they need to be civilized, which I would argue is the exact project that an organization like Equality Now is engaged in. But something like TWAIL flips that on its head and says, actually, the third world and the global south are spaces of radical possibility that teach us about our own insufficiency and our own deficiencies within the global north. And they're spaces that we can learn from. And so when I put TWAIL in conversation with abolitionist feminism, for me, what that means is we can think about how instead of importing carceral feminism or exporting carceral feminism into a place like Pakistan to intervene after an honor crime is committed, we can actually use a place like Pakistan by retelling Qandeel's life as somewhere that might actually offer us lessons as people who think about abolitionist feminism and of extricating feminism from its really deep ties to police and prisons. And so again, it's just somewhere that teaches us about the epistemic insufficiency of our kind of frameworks of feminism and justice within the global north. And to do all of this, I focus on the pre-existing Pakistani law before it was repealed to mandate a sentence for what they saw as like a loophole for honor crime. But I go back to that law and I think about it more deeply, which, like I said before, was like a holdover from Sharia in Pakistan, and how it had this space and this emphasis on concepts like forgiveness and mercy, which I talked about earlier. Like it was a form of mercy for the family. It was a form of mercy for the person accused of the crime, and understanding that when people may commit acts of what we see as like the most heinous forms of violence, there's often all kinds of institutional, structural, societal things that lead up to that moment. It's always more complicated than just criminal and victim, right? And that people are often victimized, and that leads them into kind of committing crimes. This is like the most basic analysis of like abolitionist lessons, but this being like a form of mercy to that person. Also as somewhere that had this law having a space for family and community over the state and over the legal system, which is something that abolitionists are really trying to do within the global north now, right? Instead of seeing the first response to all things being carceral and being punitive and being invoking police and prisons, instead allowing for communities to work through issues within themselves, allowing for families to work through issues within themselves. So all of kind of these radical possibilities that abolitionists are building to within the US, I talk about looking to Pakistan as an instructive example for all of them. And finally, I just end with thinking really deeply about revisiting Qandeel and the question of honor. So when I think about honor in relationship to Qandeel, I'm not thinking about this like a colonial framework or an imperial framework like honor crime. What I think about is what it means to really deeply honor somebody like Qandeel. And to me, that means honoring her legacy by retelling her story. And it also means honoring her by thinking not just about how we respond when something as heinous as what happened to her happens, but instead how we actually think about constructing a world and constructing a society where these things wouldn't happen, where gender-based violence against women all around the world, within the global South and the global North, wouldn't be so normalized, and where the question of enacting violence in this way wouldn't pop into somebody's head. So to me, that seems like the easiest way and the deepest way of really connecting her to the question of honor is not through something like an honor crime, but through honoring her legacy. And that means putting abolition in conversation with Twail, in conversation with a real deep re-examining of her life and seeing her as a person and not just as a victim of this kind of colonial framework of honor crime. So I realize I talked for a while. I hope all of that presentation made sense. I'm going to end there. And there's so much more that I could talk about within this presentation. I tried to condense all of it down, but this is something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm just really happy that I had the opportunity to talk to all of you about it. And I'll end and kind of take questions and switch into the Q&A. But thank you all.
Can you do the stop sharing?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Everybody applause there. Show some love from CPP.